The Erie Railroad relocation was the most anticipated post-war project and the improvement which most changed the appearance of the city. Public Service Commission hearings were first held in 1937 to change the Erie's route through the city. A report submitted in 1938 listing accidents along the Erie Railroad documented that 70 persons, an average of one a year, had been killed along the Erie right-of-way in the vicinity. Many others had been injured. Although this evidence seemed damaging enough to bring prompt action, 14 hearings were held by the PSC before a satisfactory relocation plan was accepted in June 1945. This plan moved the Erie tracks on the north side of the river generally parallel to those of the Delaware, Lackawanna, and Western. It was necessary to remove 25 grade crossings and 2 bridges. The Erie yards were moved to Gang Mills. The D.L.N.W. station was moved, and the Erie constructed a new freight depot on West William Street, as well as a new passenger station between Sly and Bridge Streets.
This train will be making 2 stops here at the station. The train will make a first stop and board passengers, and then the train will fill up and board the remaining passengers. Passengers who will be boarding when the train makes the first stop will be coach passengers who are traveling to. These passengers will please board at location 5. Sleeping car passengers will also be boarding on the first stop. Sleeping car passengers who are occupying car 8100 and car 8120, you will please board at location 1 on the first stop.
In retrospect, it seems unfortunate that the 2 lines did not consolidate at that time, but in the immediate post-war era, the railroads were prosperous and competitive. Apparently, no one noticed the significance of events like the Erie suspension of passenger service on the Rochester Division after 87 years in the fall of 1947. No one could foresee that the 2 roads would merge in 1960. In 1945, the railroads were modernizing their equipment. Both lines were introducing diesel locomotives, and Corning's reaction was to complain about the raucous blast of the diesel horn, which was even more shattering than the familiar steam engine whistle. On March 27, 1946, the Corning Evening Leader headlined the news that the New York legislature had voted $10 million for Corning's Erie project. A few months later, the headlines announced another huge construction job, a $7,600,000 state highway for the Corning area. Construction was to follow the relocation and utilize Erie Avenue as its route. Arterial highway was to become an important new term for the area. The first work of what was cited by the local press as the biggest construction job in the history of the New York State Department of Public Works was to prepare the new Erie route and complete necessary changes on the D.L.N.W. Railroad. On November 22, 1952, the Erie was cut over to its new right-of-way. For the first time in 100 years, the South Side did not shake with the passing of trains and received showers of soot and steam. Residents no longer needed to time their trips to the business district by the Erie schedule. They were no longer a perennial excuse for tardiness to work and school. Although the trains were gone, a massive cleanup job remained during which the business district endured months of dirt and disruption. The concrete watchmen's shanties were lifted up and carted away. Rails and ties were removed, followed by construction of a highway base and eventual paving. At this time, the arterial highway extended west only to Chestnut Street. The momentous task was finally completed, and the week of October 10, 1954 was set aside as Achievement Week for celebration for the Corning Painted Post area. Monday was Education Day, and all schools held open house from 3 to 6 p.m. Dr. James E. Allen, the New York State Deputy Commissioner of Education, spoke that evening. Tuesday, Industry Day, was highlighted by an open house at the newly constructed Corning Evening Leader Building on Pulteney Street and by various industrial displays. Wednesday, Civic Day, was the climax of the week with a dedication of the new highway and a personal appearance by Governor Thomas E. Dewey and Senator Irving M. Ives, the Republican candidate for governor. Mayor Joseph Andrews threw the switch to light the 102 modern lights along the roadway. They were energized by a replica of Thomas Edison's first incandescent lamp. Thursday, National Affairs Day, saw a meeting of 700 delegates representing 37 chambers of commerce from New York State and Pennsylvania. Friday was Sports Day, but Hurricane Hazel caused a postponement of the scheduled CFA Geneva game until Saturday, which was Merchants' Day and marked by many special promotional events. The new arterial seemed a sign of progress and hope for the citizens of the area. However, adjusting to driving it was not without hazard. The Corning Evening Leader published a special article and photographs to educate the driving public on the proper way to make a left turn. Somewhat later, the city speed limit was raised to 30 miles an hour, with the council's warning that it would be strictly enforced. As if to erase even the memory of the railroad, the name Erie Avenue became Denison Parkway. Although the term arterial highway was commonly used, the new highway was not recognized as a rapid transportation corridor. Rather, it was accepted as a modern, attractive commercial street. By October 1956, the Corning Evening Leader proudly boasted that there were 8 new businesses on the parkway. The first business actually constructed on the completed arterial was a gas station on the southeast corner of Cedar Street. A large old house, which was reputed to have once belonged to Dr. William E. Gorton, the first mayor of the city, was demolished to clear the site in November 1954. The Corning Building Company, which celebrated its centennial in 1948, and Corning Natural Gas had, however, constructed their buildings during the relocation interim. Woolworths, on the site of the old Opera House, joined W.T. Grant on the south side of the Pine Walnut Street block of the Parkway. Across the street, the Francis Hotel and the old Corning Evening Leader building were razed to make site for Newberry's and J.C. Penney Company.
Susquehanna 1, 1984, Jim Costy, Rich Martin, Railroad.
Adventure.
The Susquehanna comes to Corning.
Boy, the other night I was standing there in Corning on the old Erie main, Gang Mills, and I saw 8 trains in about 4 hours. Yeah, decent. Yeah, there's 2 D&Hs and 6 counting. We ought to be running a van train today, too, a TV-100S.
Amtrak Special 272, over. Yeah, they wanted to know what time they wanted that train called to go south out of Corning. Amtrak Special 272, over.
Go! There it is.
272 to the Hornell dispatcher, over. Approaching CP 75.
Lined up waiting for you. What's the plan of attack, Don? Can you tell me?
We're going to pull in onto the industrial, pull right downtown, unload the passengers. When everybody's off, we plan to back out. Plan to turn it, I guess, right at Gang Mills. Hey, you said there's no room in the yard?
That I know of.
It's 106 to Don Joseph. Yes, Don, Mike. Start it at the glasses. Roger, we'll turn it at the glasses.
All right.
Jilson's running this.
I know it. I heard him on the scanner.
You hear they're going to turn them at East and West Glass? Yeah, well, that'll be neat. See you down in Corning. Yeah, down at Bridge Street.
Carrick and myself will be in the cross of Bridge Street to help you flag it over.
Roger, you and Mr. Carrick will be at Bridge Street crossing.
They're going right downtown.
6 to Jim Gunderman.
Jim Gunderman.
Yeah, okay, Jim, all set up on this end of the train. How you look back there?
Oh, looks good back here.
Okay, get a signal back up.
Okay, back, Amtrak 72.
Roger, 272, coming back. Conrail, that's 106 to that's 101, over.
It's 101.
The Amtrak special is departing Corning, showing west.
That's a Roger.
West Platte up to North Platte and back out to East Platte that way.
Roger.
Now, we've got a lot of people in the yard and in the area. You know about the fact that we're going to recrew the train down in Corning so as to not stop the train till there.
Okay, you're going to have the outbound crew at Baker Street?
No. The outbound crew, the new crew will get on the train at Corning after you stop the boarding of the passengers.
Oh, you want the inbound crew to take the train right back down to Corning?
That's right.
That's a Roger.
Yeah, there's a number of people. I don't want anybody crawling on the train at one of these intermediate points.
Okay.
401 June 17, 1984. The extra Amtrak 272. Location CP North Glass. Employee receiving. Fireman Jolson. Receiving dispatcher Anderson authorizing. Permissions grant line 1 occupy Corning. Secondary track. Both directions. Between CP North Glass. Milepost 68 over. Read correctly 1:50 p.m.
1:50 p.m.
We're up here in Gang Mills. It's 202. And the Amtrak is down by Water Street. Departing Corning.
Brakes are released back here. Roger. Amtrak, passenger extra 272 to the Hornell dispatcher, over.
Hornell dispatcher headed answering the Amtrak special 272, over.
Amtrak 272, ready, copy 401 for the Corning secondary.
CT 401 dated June 17, 1984. Extra Amtrak 272. Location CP 75. Ham. Dispatcher W. Heather. And line 1, Corning secondary track. In south direction between CP 75 and Jersey. Line 3, permission pass block limit station, CP 75. Beeman, Grand, Woodhouse.
Car off on the westbound main. Clear the swarm down there.
No, Woodhouse and Stone, over.
Time repeated correctly at 357 p.m. Over.
Roger, 3:57 p.m.
Hornell special.
This is the Patterson Bridge.
Ladies and gentlemen, the Railroad Hour. And here comes our star-studded show train. Tonight, the Association of American Railroads presents a memorable musical hit starring your host, Gordon MacRae. Yes, tonight another great musical success is brought to you by the American Railroads. The same railroads that also bring you most of the food you eat, the clothes you wear, the fuel you burn, and all the other things you use in your daily life. And now, here is Gordon MacRae.
Thank you and good evening, ladies and gentlemen.
The railroads of the nation, cooperating through the Association of American Railroads. And now I'd like to present to you William T. Parris, president of that association. Tonight, Mr. Parris is in St. Louis, Missouri, attending a meeting of the National Association of Shippers Advisory Board. Mr. Parris.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. As you have just heard, there is now meeting in St. Louis an organization representing the shippers of most of the nation's freight. These businessmen, 25,000 of them, work with the railroads to improve service. You and I and everybody in the country benefit directly from their cooperation. Long ago, the railroads learned that to give the very best service, they not only had to work with each other, but also with the public. 25 years ago, one group of their customers set up the first Regional Shippers Advisory Board. The work of the board was so valuable that soon there were 13 boards covering the entire country. In 1937, they joined to form the National Association of Shippers Advisory Boards. These boards, while working with the railroads, are not made up of railroad men. Instead, they are made up of shippers who work with each other and with the railroads to help provide the whole country with more adequate and more efficient transportation of freight. These boards made their greatest contribution so far during the Second World War, when their consistent, organized help was one of the things which made it possible for the railroads to handle the tremendous volume of wartime traffic in such a way as to shorten the timetable to victory. So tonight, we take pleasure in saluting the Shippers Advisory Boards and their National Association for their great contribution to meeting the transportation needs of America. And the railroads of America, your railroads, welcome you, all of you, to the first Railroad Hour.
We'll be back in just a moment. But first, as you know, America enjoys the services of many forms of transportation and finds use for them all. But there is nothing in existence and nothing in sight that could take the place of railroads in handling transportation requirements so varied and so vast as those of America. That may be one reason why General Brehon Somerville, who during the recent war was in charge of the whole tremendous business of supplying the United States Army, called the railroads the backbone of our transportation system, and declared that, quote, they must be maintained and developed primarily against the day when we should again have to call upon them to implement the defense of these United States, end of quotation. What General Somerville said about the railroads in the emergency of war is just as true in time of peace. For America's basic transportation runs on rail. And now back to Gordon MacRae. As General Somerville said in the speech I quoted to you a few minutes ago, our railroads must be maintained and developed as an essential element of our national defense. And these same railroads are the main arteries of American commerce. Since the recent war, they have carried more passenger traffic. They have moved more tons of freight, more miles. They have gotten more service out of each freight car than ever before in time of peace. In doing so, they have set new all-time records in the amount of transportation service turned out by the average freight train, all as part of America's unprecedented go-ahead drive toward maximum production and better living. As their part of this drive, the railroads are spending $1 billion a year on new cars and engines, new tracks and signals, new plant and equipment of every sort, to provide better and better service for you. In getting these new things, railroads have met the same sort of shortages and difficulties which have kept you from getting all the new things you would like to have. But the new passenger cars which were ordered during and just after the war are coming into service. More and more each day, we are seeing luxurious new coaches and sleeping cars, new dining and lounge cars, new streamlined trains on the rail. And the all-important freight car fleet is growing. Since the war, nearly 200,000 new freight cars have been put in service, but still more are needed, and the railroads are making every effort to get them. They have ordered another 100,000 new cars, enough to keep all the car builders busy for a year to come. So, right now, with the year's peak movement of freight with us, the railroads are not only working to meet today's needs, but are planning and preparing to meet any greater emergency which might be ahead. We'll return in just a moment. But first, here is a bit of information that will interest you. No man is better known for results in the field of research than Charles F. Kettering of General Motors. Speaking of railroads and the research that goes into them, Mr. Kettering said, and I quote, "No matter what other forms of transportation do or what new ones come into being, the railroads will remain the backbone of transportation." And he added, "The amazing progress made by the railroads in their first century is only a promise of what they will do." End of quotation. The progress of which Mr. Kettering spoke is the product of research, carried on not only in the laboratory, but out of the great proving ground of the railroads themselves, plus the investment of billions of dollars in the better cars and engines, tracks and signals, and all the other improvements which research and invention have devised. And right now, to realize the promise of the future to which Mr. Kettering referred, the railroads are carrying forward an ever-increasing and expanding research program. And now, and yours truly, Gordon MacRae. Here's a bit of news which means something to everybody who uses transportation. And in this country, that's all of us. The other day, the Association of American Railroads completed arrangements to build a new railroad research laboratory. It's going to be located on the campus of the Illinois Institute of Technology at Chicago. From this laboratory, much of the widespread engineering and mechanical research of the industry will be directed. This new development is completely in line with the long-time practice of the railroad industry. For many years, research has been carried on by and for the railroads in the laboratories of universities and technological institutions, and manufacturers of railroad supplies and equipment. Research has been carried on, too, on the railroads, which, in addition, have served as the proving grounds for the testing and trial of ideas, no matter where developed. There are two things we should keep in mind about all railroad research. One is that railroads don't make things to sell. They buy things, all sorts of things, from manufacturers and use them to produce transportation service. As a service industry, therefore, railroads receive the benefits of research done by almost every manufacturing industry in the country. And another thing to remember is that the railroads which serve you can never shut down to retool for next year's models. So everything new that is introduced on a railroad must work right along with what is already there during a necessary period of transition. That's why progress on the railroads is and must be an evolution, a growth, not a revolution. This new research laboratory to be built by the Association of American Railroads on the Illinois Technology campus is another forward step in a long-continued cooperative program that is going forward today more actively and on a broader front than ever before. You will see its results more and more in the new equipment coming into service on the railroads in ever-increasing numbers, just as one part of what Mr. Kettering called the amazing progress of the railroads. Ladies and gentlemen, the Railroad Hour. And here comes our show train. Today, the railroads are finishing up their part in the task of getting people home from their Christmas and New Year trips. But even while winding up this important job, the railroads are already well along with arrangements for the efficient handling of another big travel movement, the swift, comfortable journey of people from all over the country to Washington. See that great national ceremony, the inauguration of a president of the United States. Going to the capital city to take part in this inauguration or to see it is a traditional American custom. And for more than a century now, the railroads have played an increasingly important part in its observance. When Martin Van Buren was inaugurated in 1837, a branch railroad had just been built to Washington. To the nation's capital, this new road brought what the newspapers called a great concourse of respectable strangers from all parts of the Union. At least 1,000 people arrived on the train. As population increased and the rail network spread over the country, more and more interest was taken in the great national ceremony. The number of persons going to the inauguration also increased, until in modern times the railroads have been called upon to bring into Washington and to take home again more than 100,000 persons in a single day. This year it is anticipated that the attendance at the ceremony will exceed that of any previous inauguration. Celebration will not be limited to the one day of the inauguration itself, but will extend over most of that week. In addition to the official ceremony, the colorful 3-hour parade, and the numerous other special features, there will be an opportunity to visit the important National Historic shrines in and around the capital city. So once more, the railroads are making ready to carry the throng who will be going to Washington to see President Truman inaugurated on January 20th. Carry them in any and all weather, dependably, comfortably, safely. We'll return in just a moment. But first, here is a reminder. If you want a good picture of just how busy our country is, one of your best yardsticks is the number of freight cars loaded and moved each week. The Car Service Division of the Association of American Railroads keeps an accurate check on such figures. They report that during 10 weeks out of the past 11, an average of more than 900,000 cars have been loaded each week. That's nearly enough loaded cars each week to make 3 unbroken trains stretching all the way from the Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean. This year, the average freight train has turned out more transportation service an hour than ever before. This was done first by hauling more tons in each train, and second by keeping the trains moving faster and more steadily. Another thing that helped to improve our railroad service has been the new freight cars, which the railroads are building and buying as fast as they can get them. And these new cars are but one item in the billion-dollar-a-year improvement program of the railroads. One detail in their determined drive provides still better service for you. And now back to your host, Gordon MacRae. We mentioned earlier this evening that the railroads during 10 weeks out of the past 11 moved an average of more than 900,000 carloads of freight each week. This couldn't have been done without a lot of new freight cars. And the fact is that since the end of the war, the railroads have put in service more than 200,000 new freight cars. And they have put as many more in new car condition by a major program of repairs and rebuilding. That's a lot of freight cars, but it isn't enough. So the railroads have ordered another 111,000 new freight cars, enough to keep the car builders busy for a full year to come. And before these are built, still others will be ordered. Altogether, these 300,000 new cars are costing the railroads more than $1,250,000,000. And that's just part of what the railroads are spending to provide better service for the business of the country and for you. When it comes to spending money, the railroads are in the same fix as the rest of us. What they can spend depends on what they make. And so, railroad service of the future depends upon railroad revenues now. That's another reason why it means something to everybody that railroads shall be financially able to keep on making the improvements necessary to meet the growing needs of this growing nation. The Railroad Hour show train will return in just a moment. Meanwhile, just a reminder that 30 years ago this week, this coming Thursday, the guns were quieted along the Western Front. No one who experienced it can forget that first Armistice Day. So this is a week for remembrance of those who brought us victory in 1918, and of the other men and women who in the Second World War once more fought to preserve the things that make America free. Many of these men and women were railroaders. Some of them, the 30-odd thousand men of the military railway service, were soldier railroaders in foreign lands. They ran during the war period the railroads in 19 different countries located on 4 of the 5 great continents of the earth. Others of these railroad men served with other elements of the Transportation Corps of the Army and with the transport services of the Navy to provide the worldwide movement of men and material and supplies so essential to victory. Still other railroaders had no connection with transportation during the war. They were soldiers, sailors, airmen in the armed services of their country. Altogether, from the ranks of the railroads, there went into the armed services of the nation more than 350,000 men and women, an army in themselves. To them, and to the millions of other Americans who were in the service of the country in the 2 world wars, the nation owes the grateful remembrance of which this Armistice Week is a symbol. We return now to Gordon MacRae. I'd like to point out that 30 years since the armistice of November 11, 1918, which brought to an end the hostilities of the First World War, have seen amazing developments in every department of life. And in no field have there been more new developments or greater progress than in the field of transportation. This is true of transportation on the highways, on the water, in the air, and on the rails. Between the end of the First World War and the beginning of the Second, the railroads of the United States spent an average of $500 million a year on the improvement of their plant and facilities. Much of the improvement was undramatic, straightening out curves, cutting down grades, putting in better signals or communications, improving shop machinery and practices, as well as building and buying new and better engines and cars. But when the great test of the Second World War came, these undramatic improvements, made and continued year after year, paid off for the nation. For despite all the other developments, and even after all the billions of public funds which had been spent on other ways of transportation, when emergency came, it was to its railroads that the nation turned. It was the railroads which carried 90% of the war freight and 97% of the organized military travel. And nothing has happened since the war which in any way diminishes the importance, indeed the absolute necessity, of maintaining in full force and vigor these railroads, which in time of peace are essential to commerce, and in time of war are vital to victory. And now, Let's consider Thanksgiving Day, or rather 2 Thanksgiving days. The first one was more than 300 years ago, when a tiny band of immigrants, precariously hanging on to what was little more than a beachhead on the very edge of a wilderness continent, set aside a day in which to give thanks for the bounty and blessings which they had received in America. This week, another Thanksgiving Day will be observed, this time by a great and numerous people, securely occupying the whole of the vast continent, which was a wilderness and has now become one of the most richly productive countries of the earth. The Pilgrims celebrated their first Thanksgiving Day with a dinner made up of whatever was right at hand near Plymouth: grain and vegetables from the garden patches, fruits and nuts from the surrounding forests, turkeys shot wild in the woods. By contrast, most of the people who will celebrate Thanksgiving Day this week live 1,000 miles and more from most of the food they will eat. But they are able to draw to their dinner tables, wherever they might live in America, the products of a whole continent, and not just on Thanksgiving Day, but on every day of the year. And what is true of food is typical of everything else we use. For here in America, the producer has the widest possible markets. The consumer has the broadest possible choice of sources of supply. In this great national competitive market, made possible by the continent-wide low-cost transportation service of American railroads. Now, your host, Gordon MacRae. While we're waiting, let's go back for a moment to that little talk we were having about Thanksgiving Day. Traditionally, this is the day to give thanks for the fruits of the earth harvested during the past season. This year, not only Americans, but people all over the world have special cause to be thankful. For this year, American farmers have harvested a record corn crop and near-record crops of wheat, of other grains, and of many staple fruits and vegetables. It is the job of American railroads to collect and distribute this bountiful harvest to wherever it is needed in this country, and to our coastal ports for shipment overseas. This year's record crops have been handled faster and more efficiently than ever before. That's because of fine cooperation of shippers and receivers of freight in the prompt loading and unloading of cars. Yes, and because of the more efficient use by the railroads of the new equipment they have bought and the improvements they have made. Our country's high standard of living is based on 2 things: high production and widespread distribution. These are not mere accidents. They are products of our American institutions of human freedom and our system of enterprise and individual opportunity, of which both the American farmer and the American railroads are essential parts. Brought to you by the American Railroad. First, let me ask you this question. Have you ever realized how directly the service of our railroads on the land is connected with the operation of the ships of our Navy at sea? Well, to the men who are responsible for building, maintaining, and operating those ships, the connection is very real and vital. That's why Admiral Louis Denfeld, Chief of Naval Operations of the United States Navy, has pointed out, and I quote, that land transportation is as vital to our Navy as water transportation. And he added, quoting again, most of the land transportation that is so essential to the Navy is performed by the railroad. What is true of the Navy, as described by Admiral Denfeld, is true of every other part of our national defense. And it is equally true of the peacetime commerce by which we all live. For America's basic transportation runs on rails. And now back to your host, Gordon MacRae. We were talking about Admiral Louis Denfeld, Chief of Naval Operations of the United States Navy, and what he said about how our Navy's needs land transportation, most of which is provided by railroads. Looking to the future, the Admiral said, and I quote, "From the standpoint of national security, the readiness of the railroads is equal in importance to the readiness of the Navy." End of quotation. To meet such a responsibility, to be in readiness for emergency, the railroads have to do their daily jobs as they come along. But they have to do more. They must think ahead, plan ahead, spend ahead for progress and improvement. That's what the railroads have done and are continuing to do. That's why they were able to meet the demands of defense in the Second World War. That's why they are today turning out so much more transportation service than in the years just after the First World War, and doing it more dependably and more efficiently. That's why railroads today would be better able to meet the impact of a national emergency than they were 9 years ago when war broke out in Europe. But what has been done is not enough. If the railroads are to meet fully the day-by-day demands of agriculture, industry, and commerce, and to be found adequate to national needs in a time of crisis, two things are essential. The first is that railroads shall have a chance to secure the materials and equipment needed both for daily operations and upkeep now, and for the improvements and expansion which railroads need to make and want to make for the future. And the second is that railroads shall have a chance to earn revenues in line with today's costs, earnings which will enable them to make the improvements which always will be needed to meet the needs of a growing nation. The Railroad Hour show train will return in just a moment after a brief pause for station identification. And now, your host, Gordon MacRae. Well, here we are, starting on that last week just before Christmas. The week that's likely to get pretty frantic for a lot of us. There's that shopping that hasn't been done yet, and the gift wrapping, and the last-minute Christmas mailing, if you didn't follow the good, sound rule of mailing early. And then there's a lot of decorating and a lot of preparing for Christmas dinner and a dozen or two other things that have to be done. Yes, it takes a lot of planning, as well as a lot of doing to get ready for Christmas. It started weeks, even months ago. Producers began to turn out their materials, the manufacturers to make their goods, the merchants to stock their shelves. And all through that process, you'd find railroads doing their indispensable part, bringing the raw materials together at the place of manufacture, hauling the fuel, and bringing in the food and the other supplies needed to keep the work going, distributing the product, delivering the goods all over this land. Now, during all these weeks and months, you might not have been on a train. You probably didn't go into a railroad freight house. But just the same, the railroads were working for you, all to the end that so far as transportation is concerned, you might lack nothing, which could help to make this a Merry Christmas. And now... Earlier this evening, we were talking about the planning and preparation which goes into making the Christmas season what it is. For a lot of us, one of the high spots of that season will be a trip, for Christmas is the traditional reunion season of the year. It's the time when all members of the family gather happily together in one home, enjoying to the full the warm, friendly spirit of Yuletide. That's why weeks and months ago, railroads began to plan and prepare for the increased travel which Christmas brings. It was necessary first to figure ahead as closely as possible how many of you would travel, and where, and when. The next step was to line up the extra cars and the extra trains that will be needed. That means also lining up the extra people that will be needed to run them, and making the necessary arrangements in busy terminals to get the trains in and out promptly, and to take care of the crowds. Many of these things can be planned ahead on the basis of experience and expectation. Then there comes along sometimes the unexpected. Weather, for example, a storm, snow, fog, icy roads would mean that a good many of you who plan to travel some other way might change your minds when the time comes to go and decide to go in the warmth and comfort and safety of the train. And if that should happen, the railroads will do their best to take care of you, too. So the railroads are making ready to carry you and your family on your Christmas journey, and they hope that many of you will ride with them. But no matter how you go, they wish you a safe journey and a joyous reunion at journey's end. The Railroad Hour show train will return in just a moment after a brief pause for station identification. Did you ever notice the way folks talk sometimes about the railroads, just as if they were all one big railroad? Actually, there are about 600 different railroads operating in the United States. Some of them operate over thousands of miles of track spanning great sections of the country. Some run just a few miles between local stations. Others operate joint terminals for 2 or more railroads in cities. Whatever the kind of operating they do, each one of them has its own business to do, its own problems to meet, its own services to perform. But there are some things common to all of them, large and small. They all are part of the great national and indeed continental system of transportation, which makes it possible for any shipper anywhere to send his goods anywhere else that railroads run, all as one transaction. He doesn't have to deal with a lot of railroads, just the one in his own town. And there's another thing common to all these railroads. They are, every one of them, part and an essential part of every place they serve. They are not some distant and abstract something, the railroad. They are part of your town. Railroad men and women work there. Railroad wages are paid there. Railroad supplies and materials are bought there. Railroad property is owned there. And railroad taxes are paid there. Because railroad service is so widespread, because railroads go so many places, all of us are likely to overlook this big and simple fact about it. The fact that everywhere the railroad goes, it is a local business enterprise, a citizen of every community it serves. We were talking a few minutes ago about the railroad as a citizen of every community it serves. Like any other, it does its share in meeting the costs of government and public institutions and services. It does so through the taxes it pays on its property or its earnings. Now, everybody pays taxes, but there's a difference between the taxes which railroads pay and most of the taxes which many other forms of commercial transportation pay. The difference is in what's done with them. Railroad taxes are not used to build and maintain railroad tracks or terminals. Railroad taxes are like the taxes you pay on your home or your property. They are used to help pay for the defense of the nation, for the maintenance of public institutions and public welfare services, for public health and public schools, and they even help to pay for the highways and the waterways and airports and airways, provided and maintained at the expense of the taxpayers for the use of other forms of commercial transportation which compete with railroads. So when you think of the railroad in your community, think of it not just as the railroad, but as a fellow citizen.